Start by reading our mission statement about the Institute so people have a little background about the Institute and kind of get in the mood to make the break and the transition into our program. And many of you know, but let me just remind you that the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library was founded about 20 years ago, no, 15 years ago, to further the library's goals of preserving our written heritage, as well as supporting emerging struggles for racial and gender equality and for socialism. The members of the ICSS are active in different aspects of the people's struggles in the Bay Area and globally. Some of us are affiliated with specific political parties and tendencies, others are not. We respect one another, but we do not necessarily agree on all issues. Accordingly, the opinions expressed in our lectures, workshops, and publications are those of the authors only and do not represent any kind of group consensus on the issues discussed. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been in the past. And as a group, we continue to draw inspiration from the work of Karl Marx, including his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." So that's what we do here. That's who we are. I think we've assembled a good group of people here and an excellent speaker. So I will turn it over to Raj, back to Raj, to let him proceed with the program. And I'll be back with you at the break to talk about future programs.
Okay, thanks, Gene. And I will do a very brief introduction to Laura. Laura Wells ran as a Green Party candidate for governor in 2010 on a platform of public banking and tax the rich by reforming Proposition 13. And she sent an email regarding public banking, which I got the benefit of receiving, and I immediately contacted her and asked her if she will do a program here to speak on the public banking, and she has kindly agreed to in short notice. So without taking the valuable time of everybody, me saying anything further, Laura Wells, I present to you Laura Wells. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Raj. And thanks everybody. I see so many familiar names and some that are not familiar. It's very wonderful to have you all here because public banking is one of those possible solutions. And so I'll start out, I imagine that a lot of people know what a public bank is, but I'll start out with a brief summary of that. And how many people know a state in the United States that has a public bank? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so most people, a lot of people know that that's North Dakota. So North Dakota started out having a public bank in 1919, so it's been over 100 years ago. But what a public bank is that it's either a state or a city, a county, a region owns the bank itself. It's run as a public bank. The Bank of North Dakota is called the state of North Dakota doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. It uses the money that it has, rather than relying on the Wall Street banks, it's relying on the state bank. I remember when I ran in 2010 for governor, my introduction to it was that a person told me, you should look into state bank. And I did, and it became one of my major platform planks. And I was very glad that I did, because a lot of people first heard about it through that campaign. I would have a flyer that, and people would go by, and often what people are trying to do with flyers is to avoid picking it up, whereas I want them to pick it up. And so they'd be breezing by and I'd say, "A State Bank, invest in California, not Wall Street." And they would turn around and come back and pick it up, because that was an idea. 2010, 2 years after the global financial meltdown, a time that we knew that the Wall Street banks were not on our side, as they've never been. So the public bank actually acts almost as a mini Fed. It's generally the way that they've been so far, the way it is in North Dakota, is that it's like a banker's bank. It's not a commercial consumer bank. It's a banker's bank. So it backs up the local banks. North Dakota has a higher percentage, a higher per capita number of local community banks than any other state. And that would include credit unions. After the 2008 meltdown, the only state that did not have a big budget problem was the state that was not hooked into the Wall Street banks, and that was North Dakota, because they had their own bank. So it partners with the local banks. It's not in competition with the local banks. And one of the things that, when you think about the small businesses during this time of the COVID-19, my biggest worry is that the small businesses, you know, the mom and pop shops, the one of a kinder, those kind of places that I personally, and so many of us, like so much better than the transnationals, they don't have necessarily the staying power of the huge transnationals. And so if there were a state bank, what happens is that they would be backed up. They would still have loans in the local banks. Let me explain what happens if it's a small business in a regular state. They start out with a small local bank. And what happens is that as they grow, the small bank no longer can serve all of their needs. And so then they do what they call these little partnerships with the Wall Street banks. And so, you know, the big four, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they'll say, okay, well, we'll partner and we'll do this part of the banking business of this small but growing business. And then sooner or later, they lure away the consumer with, make them an offer they can't refuse, and the local bank no longer has any of their business. Then the Wall Street banks do their shenanigans, and who's in trouble? Everybody, including the small banks. Whereas if there were a state bank, as in North Dakota, then the state bank is not being affected by Wall Street and can still back up the businesses and give them credit, will give them good loans, and not just shut them out. So the bank, so back to 2010, I found out about the state bank and found out about Ellen Brown. So Ellen Brown at that point had written Web of Debt and explained the way that the money supply is actually created. And as she says, we don't actually have a money system, we have a credit system. So the banks make loans, you know, they don't grab the money out of safes or take the money from anywhere. They just, you know, write an entry and say, we're making you a loan. And then the people pay it back with interest. So that was Web of Debt, talked about that. And it's a complicated thing. I think it took me years to really get my head around that. And then her next book was The Public Bank Solution. And then after that, she's written Banking on the People. But in 2010, that was the year that for the crime of suggesting that we should have public banks and reform Prop 13, and for trying to get into the audience of a debate. That was the year that I was arrested outside the debate up in San Rafael. But a month later, there was a group of us, a group of people, including Ellen Brown and a lot of other people, who got together and created the Public Banking Institute. That was December 2010, so that was almost 10 years ago, and created the Public Banking Institute. So remember that name, because when you want to know what's happening in San Francisco or the East Bay or Santa Rosa or anywhere around the country, not just California, go to publicbankinginstitute.org and you'll find all sorts of great information. Also, ellenbrown.com is where you can find out about Ellen Brown's books, and she writes lots and lots of blogs and articles about public banking, all aspects of the economy. So Public Banking Institute started in 2010. Now, it's been almost a competition among people in the different states and the different cities to see who's going to get one first. And California had a great achievement actually last fall. Was AB 857 in October was signed into law, and that was something that created a pathway, got rid of the obstacles to creating public banks, and created a pathway to public banks within California. So that was just last October. Now, what happened, I guess that was maybe December, but we really started getting word of it really in maybe February, the coronavirus. So the pandemic started. Now there have been all sorts of bills and acts and things that are supposed to help us. I love the Orwellian CARES Act, which is Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Okay, so in that, mostly what's happening is that a whole lot of money, trillions, like 3 trillion, is has been found. And it's going out, and where is it mostly going to? It's going to the big, corporations and the banks, and a little bit to the states, like 150 billion, which divided by 50 is an average of 3 billion per state. And they're not supposed to use it for anything that was already budgeted in March of this year. Now they budget everything in March, by March of this year, they've budgeted everything for the coming year. And it's just supposed to be used for things related to the coronavirus. Now, what has happened with the states is that they have less money coming in and more expenses going out. So, and legally, they're not supposed to be able to run a deficit, whereas the country runs a deficit that's never going to end. It's the nature of the way money works. It's a constant deficit, and the banks are not allowed to do that. So I think I heard that, is it Mitchell, said that it would be preferable, rather than bailing out the states, which would of course be a horrible thing, it would be preferable to change the law so that they can allow the states to go bankrupt. So there you go. But there is something in the CARES Act, and you can find out more about it again by going to publicbankinginstitute.org, and they have those little photos that slide through. There's one that talks about a letter to the states. So a letter was sent to the state governors and treasurers of all the states in the last couple of months that talked about an opportunity that has come up where the states could actually create a state bank, and by using emergency powers to set up a state-owned public bank. And then we could take advantage of the Federal Reserve, which you've probably heard has lowered the interest rate to like 0.25%, which is virtually free money, but only to the banks. So the state creates a bank, and then we can get interest at that rate, as opposed to, I mean, do you ever wonder why the banks are getting an interest rate of 0.25 and the interest rates on credit cards are still about 21%? And I think they did actually lower them, I understand, by 0.5%. So maybe 20.5%. So if we have our own bank, then whatever interest we charge, we don't have to charge as much interest because it's not a profit-making entity. And the interest that does come in gets folded back into the state, for projects and things like that. Or for services, or for whatever, it gets folded back in as profit to the government itself, and helps the budget. And according to the information on the site, I'll quote this: "We are told by our banking advisors that the basic mechanisms for a bank could be set up in a matter of a month using these federal powers." So now is the time to really pressure our public officials to get moving on that. One of the things that comes up, a question that comes up, has to do with, who's running the bank? And one of something that I've heard is that, like, the Bank of North Dakota prefers to bring people in as and train them to do the public banking, rather than take people who've gotten into the usual banking process, so that they come in and they're just bankers. They're not speculators, they're not whatever, they're just bankers. Remember when banking used to be boring? It was like, because they weren't playing games, they were with the money, they were just helping people with homeowners, trying to see if somebody was likely to pay the money back and all of that. So let's, I think we can move to Q&A now, and comments and all that.
Okay, Jean, before we go there, Jean, you usually have some announcements to make.
Yeah, I was hoping for a longer talk here, but
I usually like the Q&A. I'll probably go long on the Q&A, but can I interrupt one? There was also a letter to Congress about what Congress could do in the publicbankinginstitute.org, the various solutions that Congress could do. And one of the things that Ellen Brown is working on, and a lot of people are starting to look at, and it's totally related, is UBI, Universal Basic Income. Okay, Jean.
Okay, Jean.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura. That was excellent, as we expected. And before we go to Q&A, we have a few little things we'd like to take care of. First of all, next week, we have another excellent program coming up. On May 31st, it will be revolutionary organizations in the US. And here's the blurb. Lenin advocated for and created a revolutionary socialist party of a new type more than 100 years ago. What kind of socialist organizations are required in the US today? What revolutionary organizations are here already, and how are they faring? After a short presentation by our ICSS member, Richard Fallenbaum, there will be an open discussion in which participants will present their own observations and evaluations. So that's coming up. It will be equally interesting, I believe, so I urge everybody to attend. And the other thing is, we have very good news for everybody, that you can now contribute to the ICSS enterprise. We, as you know, are a grassroots organization. We get no funds from um, the corporations or the CIA or any other organization. We are independent. We would not take foundation money if they were to offer it. So, but we have set that up, and I will let Richard um, uh, say something about that if he's so inclined. Richard.
Sure. Okay. Just one thing about next week's program. I hope people, I'm not going to give too much detail about these organizations. It's too much to go into, but people should be prepared a little bit who have knowledge of revolutionary organizations to make, brief, pithy comments about them. It's just a start of that discussion. Anyway, yeah, about contribution, I need to have screen sharing, Raj or Mehmet.
Mehmet,
Yeah,
please.
click on the green screen
I
share.
did.
Okay.
You have to allow me to screen share.
I do. Let me see. Just one minute. One more participant.
Any rate, you can contribute either through. We still need money. We're supporting the library, and we sort of made it an obligation. And you can either do it through a check or cash with to my address, or through PayPal. We may have to consider alternative. And if people have ideas of alternate pay methods, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Can you please try the screen share again, please?
Yeah.
Okay, I did put that, this is Gene, I did put that information into the chat. So
Okay.
that information
Well,
should be in
I
the
seem
chat.
to have, okay.
Just, oh yeah, there you go. Yes, good.
Okay, so there it is. The top is the PayPal, and want to thank a number of people have been quite generous, but it's a small number, and I hope people will consider, like a one-time, maybe once every 6 month donation, and that'll help a lot. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, so we are in the QA period now, and there are a number of hands. So I will just go by one, and please forgive me if yours was the first and I didn't get to you. So I'll go to Aaron first. Aaron, please, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I am an attorney calling from the Washington, D.C. Metro, and grateful to be here. And it's all new to me. And I'd like to know if Laura or others could contrast. The closest thing that I've ever heard of public banking before sounds like something called a credit union. And could you compare and contrast, if it's a reasonable comparison, how they might in some ways share some characteristics?
Okay, and I want to welcome Susan Harmon and put you right on the spot here, because Susan Harmon has been working on this for all these 10 years that I've been talking about, that the Public Banking Institute has been alive, and has been a leader in the Public Bank East Bay, which you can go to that website for all of us in the East Bay, publicbankeastbay.org. You're nodding, Susan? Okay. And the so credit unions are more like the consumer banks. They're where you have your checking accounts and and you could have more credit cards in the local banks, and you wouldn't pay the 21% interest. And, student loans, homeowner loan, business loans, I already talked about that. That's in a consumer bank, and like the credit unions can do some portion of the banking that consumers need, and local community banks otherwise. But basically the public bank backs up those banks and deals with all the liquidity things, the money that needs to be passed around one day after next, overnight, that the Wall Street banks usually do. So we take the Wall Street banks, we take the Fed, pretty much out of it. And so you might still have a strong, if you're at a local bank or a credit union, you might stay there, but they would be more stable. They would be stronger. And so that's one difference. Susan, is there anything you want to add about credit unions?
Credit unions are wonderful, and everybody should take their money out of the Wall Street banks and put it into a credit union. But credit unions are limited. Credit unions don't solve the problem of where to put public money. Credit unions can't have a limit on how much public money they can accept. So one of the things that this movement wants to do is get our public money, the money that belongs to our cities, out of the Wall Street banks, and which invest in terrible things that none of us support, and put it into public banks, which will invest in things that all of us support. So that's credit unions are wonderful for individuals. They don't do the trick for public jurisdictions.
And even businesses, they're not so much a business bank as they are individuals.
I'm not sure about that. I think they work for businesses, but I'm not 100% sure. I did want to say some things about what people can do to help this movement if this is the right time for that.
I think let's perhaps, do you have a time limitation?
No.
Okay, because maybe we'll get the specific questions and then talk about that. Although, yeah, we've mentioned a few websites, and those are definitely places to start. So that'll be great to hear the specifics.
Okay, so the next person I'll go to is Lou Rigali. Lou, your hand's been lowered. You can unmute yourself and then talk.
You may want to also give the list of who's waiting, Raj.
Okay, yeah. Jean Rule is waiting, Sharon Rose is waiting, and Norma Harrison are waiting. All these three people are waiting. And that's it for now.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think what Laura was saying was very important, and I just wanted to extend it a little bit. I'm a member of the Public Bank East Bay, an organization looking to do public banking as a local entity as opposed to necessarily a state entity. And the reason that our focus is on a local bank is that we feel the governance is real important in running a bank. And the more local a bank is, the better that it'll be serving the community that it's in. The community will have oversight. So I wanted to put that focus on that aspect of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll
You know
go.
what, I
Yeah,
think
go
this
ahead.
might,
Sorry. No, sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Laura.
excuse me. I think this might be a good time, Susan, that you were offering to tell people about what they can do. And so just segueing on what Lou just said, about the Public Bank East Bay. What do you think? Is that okay with people? Not seeing any thumbs down. Go for it, Susan.
Okay, Lou did mention the name of our group, which is the Friends of the Public Bank East Bay, and our website is publicbankeastbay.org, and it's a pretty good website. It's good for beginners, And there are also some details for people who know a lot more about this. And I did come on this call.
You
Your,
just got
your
muted.
microphone is off.
You just muted.
Oh,
Okay, now
All
you're
right.
back on.
You're back on.
okay, thank you. I did hear your whole presentation, Laura, which was very good. Thank you. There are many things happening in California. We're kind of leading the rest of the country right now. There's a movement to ask Governor Newsom to, as an emergency measure, to start a state bank to convert the infrastructure bank, which isn't really a bank, it's a revolving loan fund, to convert it to a depository bank, which would be very interesting. As Lou says, the major issue is governance, how to make it democratic and representative and accountable, and not just run by Newsom's four best friends. And there's a very strong local movement in the state. Both the East Bay and Los Angeles are working very hard and getting much closer to starting local banks. And what you can do here in the East Bay, most of the people I recognize on this call are in the East Bay. What you can do here is call your county supervisor and tell them to apply for, to approve the county's application for new funds from the Federal Reserve. This is going to get a little wonky for a minute here, but it's called MLF funds, Municipal Liquidity Facility money. And Alameda County has been allocated $456 million in that fund. And we need to apply for it. We need to issue a bond and apply for it. And the first use of that money would be to capitalize the public bank in the East Bay. So please call your supervisors and harass them, tell them to support the MLF funding, support applying for MLF funds. We have meetings every 2 weeks, and people are welcome to join them. Our next meeting is tomorrow, actually. And if you go to our website, there'll be the information there on how to Zoom in and help us make this local public bank a reality in the very near future. There's an emergency.
The website?
Sorry?
What is the website?
Publicbankeastbay.org.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so shall we go to the next question? So next in my list is Sharon Rose. I'm going to lower the hand. Please go.
Thank you. My question has to do with what you said, Laura, that the state bank is a mini Fed. So what I understood from that is that the state bank does not loan money to individuals. I can't go there and get a loan for my house or whatever, but I can bank at a community bank, which is then a member of the state bank. So, right, but then you said some other things that sounded like individuals could get money from a state bank. So it was a little confusing. The Federal Reserve is one of the foundations of US capitalism. And they're the banker's bank, which you did say. And what happens is that all their members can loan money to each other on an overnight basis. So that's what keeps everything liquid in this country, in the Wall Street banking system in this country. Federal Reserve banks also, the 12 individual banks also process checks and dispense and process cash for all their members. So my question is, how much of all of that gets taken over by the state bank as the mini Federal Reserve? I think some people jump to the conclusion or imply that somehow the state bank is outside of the capitalist system. It's some kind of socialist entity, which I don't agree, I don't think is true. It's just another, the Bank of North Dakota that's been there for so long is part of the capitalist system. It's just more friendly to and facilitates community banking, which is a good thing. So that's my clarifying question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Laura, your response.
Okay, and I'll take it. And Susan, if you want to fill in anything that's missing, that would be great. What I should say about loans, like student loans, homeowner loans, small business loans, is that having the state bank there helps facilitate those good loans to people. And the loans come from, I think that actually a state bank could probably be the source of student loans and things like that, but you get the loans through your local, your homeowners loans and your business loans through your local community bank. And when you need but the partner in that regard is the state of California, whose mission, and the mission, so it's like if it were analogous to the North Dakota, it'd be the state of California doing business as the Bank of California. And its mission is to serve the public. How well it does that is another question. But so the good loans come from the commercial banks, backed up not by Wall Street, but by the state bank. It just flew out of my head. Soviet Union, China, the Bolivarian state of country of Venezuela, they have banks. Everybody has banking, and so there is, just because something is a bank and deals with money doesn't automatically make it capitalist. In my view, and maybe this is a simple way to look at capitalism, is you take more out than you put in. That's what capital is. You have capital, you put it in, you get more back. So you're constantly taking more back than you put in. What a state bank does is that it takes in interest and builds and helps to build bridges. Like the Bay Bridge, something that I meant to mention earlier. The Bay Bridge, if that were funded by the state of California, it would not have cost anywhere near as much money as that Bay Bridge did cost. The average percent of the cost of a public project that goes to interest is 40%. 40% of the cost of things go to interest. If you're building it yourself being the state of California or the East Bay, then you are not taking more back than you're not trying to, I was just going to say, you're not trying to screw yourself. So you're trying to do the project and not make a whole ton of money out of it. Now, Susan, I'm sure you can add something to this.
What I would add is really short. It's for Sharon, we're taking a tool from capitalism and using it for good instead of evil. Banks can leverage their capital up to 10 times in loans. And that's just a magical thing that banks do. They essentially create money. And we want to do that ourselves rather than letting that tool just be used for the dreadful things that Wall Street banks are invested in.
Okay, thank you. So I go to the next person, that's Norma Harrison. And Norma, I'm going to lower your hand. and
Be
unmute
quiet,
you.
Raj.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it's always good. It's interesting to hear Laura kind of having a little trouble explaining stuff. That's how complicated taking our money and using it for other things than we want it used for is. Nice to have mentioned the socialist communist nations that use their money for their benefit. The thing that struck me is to mention, maybe everybody already knows, money from marijuana cannot be, from marijuana sales, cannot be put into the local banks. Big problem, of course. And also, people new to this, if there's anybody left that's new to it, use the participants option at the bottom of the screen and the chat option. Participants lets you raise your hand. Thank you.
Okay, your response, Laura?
Great to bring up cannabis. The entire industry that was being cut out of banking, which ironically is helping to motivate getting public banks in place, because there's this whole industry that, because of federal laws differing from state laws and all of that, that they can't get credit. Businesses run on credit. They need the money up front, and they need to be able, so a lot of times they need money up front in order to make the investments, in order to provide their services or make whatever it is that they make. Also, they need to be able to take credit cards. You know, you can't run a big cash only business. And so when the cannabis industry was prevented from doing regular banking, that was also meant that credit cards were difficult. And so ironically, by making it difficult for cannabis, that might make it a little bit easier to create a public bank, because the need will be seen by some powerful people, you know, powerful industry.
Okay, thank you. And before I go to Jean, I wanted to say something. I ran a professional practice, which I started in 1984 and got out of it 2013. So I went to Wells Fargo. Somebody says you should go establish banking and see if you can get a credit line. So I went there and they said, well, you're not bankable yet. I said, what do I have to do? He said, you have to show that you can survive for 3-4 years, then come back and then we'll give you a credit line. So I couldn't go there. Then later on, somebody told me, go, there is a new Indian bank, you know, established by some Indian bank entrepreneurs, and they will, small bank, they will look at you sympathetically because you are from that milieu. And I went there and they looked at the same things I had, and they said, you're perfectly bankable. So, you know, how the banks are not, so they're not free of that and free of prejudices. And the big banks don't care about you except as a depositor, really.
Right, and they always say the only people they want to lend money to are the people that don't need it, you know.
Right, and so actually, because when you do business, you provide, we were providing services, and you didn't collect your money. You sent your bills, and everybody knew you were a fledgling business. They knew I couldn't take them to court or anything. So they sat on it, okay? And I got paid 3 to 6 months later, if I was lucky. And so you need it about that, and it makes a world of difference. And that's how small businesses, as we are seeing, are collapsing. The restaurants that we like in neighborhoods and all other services, haircutting salons and all these other things, they're suffering right now. And the big banks, they don't care about them. They might do certain things because the government requires them to create image of being friendly. But you really need a bank that is controlled by public, even within the system. Of course, banking is both, as you pointed out, Soviet Union. Even in India, the State Bank of India is owned. India is a capitalist society, capitalist government. It's a state bank established and the 67th largest bank. And for that reason, its rules, etc., are more fair than the private banking. In India, of course, the government is now trying to use it to destroy whatever is left of the socialist fabric in India. So that's my comment, and you can further say something on it, Laura. Then we'll go to Jean. Jean is be after this.
I just want to say something more about like the global meltdown during 2008. Everybody knows that the banks got bailed out. The Wall Street banks got bailed out. And what happened then? They got even bigger. And first they paid themselves bonuses because they'd done such a fabulous job. And then what they did with all that money that they got was they bought up a bunch of smaller banks. These were the smaller banks that had made good loans, because better loans than the big banks. And why did they do that? Because they sit down, they're in the community, and the smaller banks are rooted in the community. They actually want the community to be strong. Those bankers, are interested in the loans being paid back, and so whether it's a smaller bank, whether it's like Indian, that's a great comparison to the way that a public bank would deal with people differently from the Wall Street banks. So that basically, what did the Wall Street banks do? Paid themselves bonuses, bought up the smaller banks, didn't give anybody, they get low interest rates. Interest rates are sky high with credit cards. Imagine being able to get your credit card not from Chase and Citi and all of those guys, but the local banks, and feed your community with your use of credit. Okay.
There's one quick comment before I go to Jean. The thing was, it really made a difference, and my business took off, whereas it would have died down and died out, but for the banking. So it's very important for a small business. And the thing is, a small business, of which there are 30 million in the United States, they are within the capitalist system, but they're not capitalist. This is a confusion. A lot of people think that if you are a small business, you're a capitalist. You're not a capitalist, you're a petty capitalist. And there are three classes. And this is the part that oftentimes in a revolutionary situation, the workers need to align with, as Sharon pointed out last time. Okay, Jean, please.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Laura, yeah, please go on.
And one of the things is, it's like even in Cuba now, they're starting to have more private enterprise. They're not necessarily, it's different words. To me, capitalist, who's a capitalist? People who have capital. That's about having money and then getting more money because you have money. So there's private enterprise. But another thing that you reminded me of, Raj, about the 2008 was later people said, when ordinary people complained about all that bailout money that went to the banks, people would say, well, they paid it back. That was just credit. That was just loans. They weren't given that money. They paid it back and all of that. Well, credit is what makes you survive as a business. So they gave them life support and then they paid it back. So that was, so the argument that they paid it back and therefore it was not a bailout is ridiculous. Just wanted to point that out. Okay.
Comrade Jean.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura. This was very important and did an excellent job in terms of presenting the importance of public banking. But I want to just mention the central bank. Every country, sovereign country, has its own central bank, and ours is the Federal Reserve, as you know. But a lot of people may be under the illusion that since it's called the Federal Reserve, it is a federal agency. It is not. It's a privately owned agency run by the bankers for the bankers. They do not, excuse me, they do not report to Congress. They do not report to the president. They report to themselves. And no one can look at that. Even the CIA can't look at the Federal Reserve books. The president can't look at it. nobody has any control over it, and they run the banking system in the interest of preserving capital. If they see that things look if inflation goes too high, they do certain things. They know how to manipulate this. And for example, studies have shown that when they intervene, when there are strikes, in such a way as to preserve the interest of the companies, not the strikers. So it's a very sophisticated agency. I don't claim to understand everything that it does, but I do understand that it is not controlled by either Congress or the president, and definitely not by the people. That's all I wanted to stress. And I'd like to have your comments on that. Laura.
Well, like they say, the Federal Reserve is as federal as FedEx. You know, it's like Federal Express. It's it's a name. And they have oversight, they say, by Congress, but it is not government. It's not a central bank in the same way that a central bank that is run by the government of these other countries that we've mentioned over and over. Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRICS countries.
Okay, I will go to Kim because he hasn't spoken first, and then go to Norma. Kim, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Laura. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Kim.
Lenin, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, has a chapter called The Banks and Their New Role. And in one paragraph, it's mentioned that in Germany, the Chamber of Commerce was trying to eliminate, it says they demand the limitation of the banking operations of the post office. So I was wondering if you could comment on post office banking, which used to exist in the United States and which Bernie Sanders was advocating, and how that differs from public banking or credit unions or big banking.
Okay, and again, Susan might want to chime in on this, but we have these brick and mortar, we have these buildings, these offices all over the place, including small places in the middle of, rural towns that don't even have a bank, have their post offices there. And those could be used and have been used in the past as banking, postal banking. And so they could be used again, rather than what's happening is trying to close them down, like that beautiful building in Berkeley. So they are right there and could be used as a great place for public bankings to have a physical presence in the neighborhood. And people who are unbanked could go there. There's social security checks, can go through there. I think that in the past that those were some of the ways that it was used. It was a way to get money to people. You could deposit it into those, the postal banking accounts. So yeah, that's a great element of the, of the possibility of the public banking. Susan?
Well, as everybody probably knows, the post office is in real jeopardy right now because Trump would like to privatize it. The person he's just appointed as the Postmaster General is dreadful. So I'm not optimistic about postal banking coming anytime soon, but it would be a terrific solution to the issues of the unbanked and underbanked. We are working on it. There is people in the Public Banking Institute are working on it, and working closely with one of the 4 unions, the postal unions, and maybe Congress will do something constructive about it, but I'm not too optimistic. It's good to see you, Kim.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this the post office has been under pressure for decades, for a long, long time, and they have to fund their pension funds 70 years in advance. They can't, I don't know that they can't advertise in the same way. And I would just love sometime to give FedEx or UPS or any of those people 50 cents and see what they'll give me back. The post office is a marvelous success.
Yeah.
So
So-
I was wondering if we could project the way that we would handle what it is that the banks ostensibly do or are supposed to do in an absolute communist situation. I think people need to be able to reflect how life would be. I keep saying about the horrors that we have going on through the United States, saying, well, Cuba, you don't have that problem, or the Soviet Union didn't have that problem, etc. How would we say build a bridge? The people would get together and decide the bridge needs to be built, and they would just proceed, and they would, it would be, of course, communism in every state, because you might have to order parts from distant areas or so. What's our understanding of how we would proceed absent the profit system altogether, and absent even the exchange of currency? Maybe there'd be a discussion about, I don't know, there's all kinds of possibilities, but it'd be nice for people to be able to consider what we are trying to do, what the objective of what we're trying to do.
Well, I don't know whether this, I'll just touch on a little bit of what you're saying, that what it makes me think of, and thinking about China or Cuba or Venezuela, where when they have money available to them, like China, if they want to build a transportation system, whether they want a new airport or whether they want a train system, big infrastructure projects, they are able to decide to do that and not pay 40% of the cost of it to some bankers as interest. Public housing, I understand in Vienna or something, like 40% or something of the housing is public housing, and it's really high quality housing that everybody wants, so the landlord is actually the city. So they're providing that, they provide housing, education, all of those things that when you have, we've got money is a factor in our lives. And how do you spend it? That's the issue. Education, infrastructure projects, health, dealing with our health system, our privatized health system, as everybody knows, has been shown to be completely inadequate because it wasn't profitable for anybody to have an inventory of the things that are needed during a pandemic, so it was just profitable to produce high-cost drugs for people when they're sick, but not to be prepared for something like this. When you've got, China was likely more prepared. So, but those are some of the things that makes me think of, that, people, the public, the governments can do those things for the people because they've got the money and they're not being gouged by an external bank.
And they could be using union labor, automatically. It just seems, people can't even imagine these things. I say we need to use those in our organizing to say, see what would happen, look at.
Thank you, Norma. So I'm going to go to Susan, which is identified as Michael K. Please go ahead. I think it's Susan, right? In Michael K.
Well, it's not Susan, although
Okay,
Susan is
Michael.
here. It's me,
Okay.
and I just have two questions.
Okay.
What are the politics of the public bank in the Oakland City Council? And what are the politics of the public bank in the Berkeley City Council?
And the supervisors.
And of course, the Alameda supervisors. Thank you.
Okay, Susan, do you mind if I just send that right over to you?
That's fine.
Okay.
Hi, Michael. We have a majority in the Oakland City Council. I'm pretty sure we have a majority in Berkeley. Supervisors, I think we have the 3 Oakland supervisors, Carson, Miley, and Chan. Valle, who is mostly Hayward and South, is iffy and needs the most pressure right now. Does that answer your question?
Candidates for supervisors.
And an additional question, what about the candidates for supervisor or candidates for Berkeley or Oakland that are coming up for the November election?
I have just started reaching out to the candidates for Scott Haggerty's position. He is the unincorporated areas and the furthest south in the county. I haven't looked at Oakland or Berkeley, the new candidates at all, and that's a very good idea. Thank you.
Okay, Debbie Notkin is next, but before I go to Debbie, I just want to make a comment quickly. In my last 10 years of my professional engineering career, I was designing homeless shelters and housing for those who have been ruined by the economy of neoliberalism. And when the buildings were built, the mayor came often, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will come, and the first person they acknowledged and thanked was the banker. And I said to myself, isn't it ironic? The people who put these people on the street in the first place are the ones being thanked now. So I just wanted to make that comment because it struck me so ironic that this is the state of our society where the victimizer is the one ultimately to be thanked. And this public bank will be the start of ending that kind of system, although by itself it's not sufficient. But anyway, next one is Debbie Notkin.
Hi, everybody. Laura, that was fantastic. Thank you. And just to introduce myself for the people who don't know me, I work very closely with Susan on this project. And a couple of things that I wanted to add. One is the California Public Banking Alliance, and I put their URL in the chat at the beginning, has a list of 6 things that are particularly important, and the 6 reasons why we need public banks right now in the time of COVID-19. And to some extent, that also speaks to Norma's question about what we could do with banks in a better system. So I just wanted to read those. They are: deliver more funds more efficiently, provide emergency funding without tapping into reserves, keep banking profits in the community to be invested, fund preventive measures for resiliency to future crises, make emergency preparedness plans more comprehensive, and divest from Wall Street. And all of this in the context of what people are calling a just and equitable recovery, a recovery that is not focused on the rich and the powerful and the white. So that's a lot of how we think about public banking. And the other thing I want to say, I heard the call for funds for this group at the beginning, but we are also mounting, Public Bank East Bay is also mounting a small dollar fundraiser. We're looking for $3 or $5 or $10 contributions, in significant part because we need the money to fund the business plan that is crucial to having a bank, but also so we can go to foundations and funding sources and demonstrate our grassroots support. So I want people to think about giving us $3 or $5 or $10 at publicbankeastbay.org.
Put that address up on the chat.
It's up on the chat, but I'll put it up again now. Okay. And thank you all so much for the thinking and talking about this, because we really do believe it's one of the few things that can really make a recovery.
Thank you.
Susan, where are you putting the money?
Thank you. I have a question for.
Can I answer that about where are we putting the money?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
So the money would go to, yes, a capitalist, a banking professional and a banking consultant who can write our business plan and get the bank open.
No, I meant where are you keeping the money until it gets spent?
Oh, we're keeping it in, we have a fiscal sponsor called Social Good. They're a small organization in Richmond, and that's where we keep the money.
And where did they bank?
I should know the answer to that. I think they bank with a credit union. They don't bank with one of they don't bank with one of the big five. I know that.
I'm just being facetious.
No, it's a good question.
No, it is a good question. We should live our principles. We're also in the process of opening an account at Beneficial, which is a
community bank and a B Corp.
Right. Three
So I have
bottom
a
line
question.
bank.
Thank you. I have a question for the three of you, Debbie, Susan, and of course Laura. Is that the post office is a great resource and is probably the starting point of having branches for the public banking system, starting with the state, but then moving, and that's probably why they want to kill it. Okay, that's probably part of the reason they're fearing now that the crisis is upon us, that people are activated. So my question is, the states that get support, and I think right now it's Trump who's driving it, but when the Democrats come in power, they'll do that too, I'm sure. But right now, in the states in which he has big support, people are suffering there too because of coronavirus. Couldn't they be argued that this post office could be used as a bank, and therefore they should support? After all, North Dakota is not a revolutionary state. Why couldn't we? I mean, I guess we need organizations to do all this, but I'm just thinking this may be the way to undermine right-wing support by saying, look, if we had this bank, everybody benefits in the community.
I think many people hope that one thing the coronavirus will do is break up some of the polarization. I know I do. And I think that the Republican leadership is very good at getting people to vote against their best interests. And one of the things we hope to do, there are good Republican talking points for both postal and public banking. Everyone is worried about predatory lending except the specific people who benefit from it. And I agree with you completely that this could be a bipartisan issue.
Okay. I don't see any hands right now. So Laura or Susan or Debbie, if you want to.
Dale has his hand up.
Who does?
Dale.
Oh, okay, sorry. Just raise the hand. Yes, Dale, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm on.
I'm sorry, I have to unmute you.
Yes.
You're unmuted. Okay, good.
Yes, this is Dale Baum. I have a question for Laura, my colleague in the Oakland Green Party. And that's because of the discussion has been about public banking on the local, state level, regional level. Why hasn't the question been taken to the national level? We've already decided here that the Federal Reserve is not part of the United States government. Why don't we simply take back the Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Engraving, and the Treasury Department and put them all under what Alexander Hamilton envisioned as the Bank of the United States? And simply because under the Constitution, the government has the right to print money. And then we could literally create money or print money if you wanted to do so to try to promote employment, economic growth. Instead, as some economists have argued, like Michael Hudson, that the whole financial tragedy of our lives is that the government now, with the Federal Reserve, is only willing to create money or print money to protect the value of assets that already are in existence.
Okay.
Okay. So one of the reasons I believe that people are working at the local level is in order to build up, to replace the Federal Reserve. If the nation state of California created a state bank, and that might be a little more likely if we create, first if Los Angeles or the East Bay creates a local, regional, or municipal bank, and then build up. The thing that at the Washington level that I think that would help us push toward having our economy be stronger rather than the Wall Street economy. So the real economy be stronger rather than the financial investment economy would be to start pushing for a universal basic income, to just take that $1,200 and have that be every month. And that would be a win-win-win-win-win, except for one little entity that would not win in their view, which is the oligarchy, which happens to be in total control of Washington, D.C. Doesn't matter, for decades. And so what people, it's not that people don't want to get rid of the Fed and don't want to make that a publicly owned central bank for the United States, but it's that where do you start? Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, that there's almost been this friendly competition within all the people that are working on public banking to see who's going to get it first, So when we get the next one, that will be a big chink in the armor of, that's 100 years since the last one was created. So that would be my answer.
Okay, Norma, I will go to Norma. Just a quick comment. The thing is, as you pointed out, and as Engels and Lenin have very clearly pointed out, the state is represents a contradiction of classes, and it acts in the interest of the ruling class, which in the United States is financial capital. So you will have to overthrow that system in order to get what you want. So Norma, you go ahead next. That's my comment. And then next, Jean and Kim. After that, Jean, Kim, and before that, I think it's somebody with 9307, which I think is Comrade Elazar, isn't it? So, okay, we'll go in order with those who have not spoken after Norma. Please, Norma, go ahead.
Dale mentioned working to maintain employment. I need everybody to agree that a job is the particular relationship of what have been made from human beings into workers, to capitalism. The job is a particular relationship from between the workers and capital, and that we need to move our minds to oppose the job and start thinking about that we do the things that need to be done in our community by democratic decisions. And if the community is the whole of civilization, that's fine. But we decide democratically what needs to be done, and it doesn't need to be done as enslavement to the profiteers. The job is a malicious, vicious imposition on our lives, and we need to take back the enjoyment that work is, that doing things for ourselves, fixing the steps or entertaining the grandchild, whatever it is, all of those things belong to us, and we should be administering them and not having to have jobs, as I say, that relate to profit.
Okay, the telephone number that ends is 9307, which I think is Comrade Elazar. Elazar, you're ready to go. You have muted yourself.
It's actually David. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, David. Okay. All right. Sorry. I thought it was Elazar. Okay.
No, that's fine. Thank you for the time. My question is, and I think it's maybe a follow-on to one of the prior questions, and that's, I think any good system has several levels to it, both in terms of size and also in terms of maybe redundancy. I know our economic system seems to have gone to just in time, where a lot of the excess has been driven out. But I'm thinking either as a planned system that with banking, there would be, of course, in this modern sense, we know there's international banking and there's national and there's state. And at the local level, I would think there would be at least one, if not several, kind of layers built in. We have savings unions and credit unions, and this notion of public banking, I think, shouldn't be new. I'm sort of wondering why it wouldn't have grown up in parallel with the unions movement. And part of the answer, of course, I would imagine would be that it's been co-opted and undermined. But I'm really on board with the public banking concept, and just wondering why maybe it's not further along than it already is at this moment. Thank you for your work and for an answer or a response.
Response from the presenters.
Let's see, why is it not further along? I wish I knew why a whole lot of things that make sense are not further along, but part of it is, you talk about jobs. Norma was talking about jobs and talking about unions. And one of the things that I really like that Richard Wolff points out is that even after the New Deal of the 30s, what happened was that the hierarchical arranged structures within businesses, within people's workplaces, stayed absolutely the same. You have no free speech, you have no freedom of movement or association or whatever. It's very much of a hierarchy. And so the fact that the corporations, that the banks, that everything retained that structure just meant bit by bit by bit, any of the gains that were made in the 30s got chipped away at. And so, and the power, just bit by bit by bit, more and more power was concentrated in fewer hands over time, until finally at the end of, toward the end of Clinton's presidency, he got rid of Glass-Steagall, put the final nails in the coffin of Glass-Steagall, and stopped the separation of the investment banking and the commercial banking, put everything at risk. Okay, so that happens bit by bit. So the cooperative nature, like the credit unions are more cooperative, having things be more cooperative would be good. I mean, there's been as long as I can remember, there have been people who have been wanting to democratize the unions. The unions are very much top down, is the way that they're run. And so it's often the rank and file thinks one way. If all things were equal, they're thinking in one direction and the leadership is going in another direction. So I'll bring this in at this point. I think that anything that we can do that reduces the resources that are in the hands of the tiny minority, the oligarchy, that reduces the power and the money, which equals power, that's in their hands. And so one of the things, and so I'm going to bring up reforming Prop 13 that's on the ballot in November. California, not Reagan, not President Reagan, but California in 1978 started this tax debacle, this tax revolt, as they say.
Proposition 13.
With Proposition 13 that flattened property tax and made it, in order to raise taxes, you needed 2/3, whereas you could lower them with simple majority in boom years and help your buddies and all that stuff. So we have a chance to make it so that corporations will start paying their fair share again. So the thing that will help to reduce the resources that are in those small group of people's hands. The important thing that needs to be said to everybody about Prop 13, because I have so often heard people go like this: I love Prop 13. It kept me in my home. I've heard that over and over. And so they need to be told, it does not affect residential property at all, not homeowners, not renters, not vacation homes, not holiday homes, not even huge huge complexes owned by huge corporations. If it's residential, it's not touched at all. That would be a wonderful, I think it's starting out with a majority, but the majority is way too small. Big money can eat into that majority very, very fast. So we've really got to tell everybody to try to get those resources out of people's hands, out of those hands. I got to where at first I was in tax the rich because we need the money for the services. I started saying, I don't care if we take that money away from them and flush it down the toilet, we'll be better off. Because then they won't have all the resources in their hands and stop every good thing that we're trying to do. So that's a long answer to the short question, but we all know how hard it has been to get anything to happen. And so the fact that the public banking has this law was passed in California, thanks to the tremendous efforts of a couple of people we got on this call, is a great step in the right direction of getting some good things to happen. Over.
Let me quickly correct Laura. It was not, the law was passed not with just a few people who were on this call. It was a statewide coalition that pulled in nonprofits, unions, everybody we could think of. It was extremely hard work and a very, very broad coalition of folks who did get that law passed.
Yes, thank you. And I do know that's true. And I do know how much some folks worked on this.
Okay, so Jean is next. After that is Kim. And I'm going to step out for a minute while Jean speaks. Give me a minute.
Okay, well, of course, I totally agree. I mean, with the Prop 13 point and other efforts that people are making to reform the system, change it in some important ways that'll improve people's lives. But I want to get back to what Dale was talking about in terms of, nationalizing, taking over the Fed, because that's not, we all know that's not a simple matter, because when you start messing with the Fed, you're messing with one of the key institutions of bourgeois rule, the capitalist rule. Namely, they include the military and the military budget, they include the educational system. All these other agencies are part of what Marxists call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That's what we live under. And the only way to get rid of that is a forcible overthrow. And Marx, Engels, Lenin all agreed that to do this requires a forcible overthrow of this system, and that will lead not to some ideal society in which everything's going to be perfect, but it will lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And we've had discussions on this in the past, and I hope we get back to it next week, because again, where are the revolutionary organizations in the United States? The nearest thing we have is the Bernie Sanders movement. And that is not quite a revolutionary organization, because I don't think it really understands what needs to happen here in the United States. So I just want to say that, want to point that out, and say we'll be returning to this at our next session and other sessions. But I don't want us to get off into a thought that, if we just come up with some good solutions, everybody will adopt it. That's utopianism. Thank you.
Okay. Laura, your response, the presenter's response.
Just to summarize it, the fewer resources that are in those few hands, the more likely we are to get anywhere. Anything we're trying to do when runs up against that wall of money. And unfortunately, it's like free speech, not free, it's expensive. owning, what do people, billionaires, do with their money? You can't buy enough jets and islands and parties. You buy power. How do you buy power? You buy politicians that run pretty cheap. Actually, it's pretty cheap to buy them. And you buy media so that you can put what people think they know inside their heads. And so with that, so that every step that we take, it's not, I don't see reform and revolution as oppositional things. I see that whatever reforms reduce the power of the people who want it all are good, because it will help even if it ends up being a full-blown revolution. I mean, currently, who's got the guns? You know, who's got the electoral revolutions are hard enough. So whatever we can do to reduce their resources, because now the trend is increase the inequality is going like crazy. Reduce that, you know, reduce. So that would be my response.
Kim, you're next. Unmute. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to thank Laura and Susan and Debbie for their presentation. And Dale triggered a memory. And I'm wondering about if anybody has any thoughts about the viability of alternative currencies. For instance, Ithaca, New York, for years has had an alternative money called Ithaca Hours. And where I live in the North Bay, Benicia has an alternative currency called, I think it's Benicia dollars. And a lot of communities around the country have alternative currencies. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the viability of those as you know, a way to counter the hegemony of the dollar.
I don't have a lot of expertise about that. I know I've heard of the, you know, I've read about them. I've known in the past, I think I knew more than I know now about them. But yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. And if there's somebody else that knows more about it.
There was something called Bay Bucks a while back here in the Bay Area. It's very hard to get alternative currencies accepted, and Bay Bucks didn't last very long, unfortunately. It's a very good idea. It's a way of keeping money in the local community. The way Bay Bucks would have worked was that local businesses would have accepted it instead of regular dollars, and so it would have generated more local economic activity, which is always a good thing.
Okay.
Hard to get it accepted.
Okay, I don't see any hands right now. And so I go back to the presenters. We still have time. It's 12:02. So we have about 28 minutes left in the program. We can end the program or they can continue. Laura, so I'll go back to you for your further comments.
And I wanted to tell you how excited I was to see you, Susan and Debbie, come on the call. And I want to thank you so much for being here, as well as a lot of other people who have a lot of expertise and experience in this area and related. So that's been great. Again, I mentioned before, maybe once or twice, the idea of UBI and the universal basic income. If you want to read a good, pretty easy to read book about that, Utopia for Realists, which I love that title. And it was written by Richard Bregman, who's a young Dutch historian. And what he talks about is not theory. He talks about actual experiences, actual studies and research that have happened, including some in the United States and in Canada, as well as people who were homeless and then given money and everybody thinking they were going to use it for drugs, or they were going to use it for alcohol, or they were going to just fritter it away and they weren't going to do anything. No, they got off the street. Not everybody, but the majority got off the street. Once they had that money, their mental health improved, because they had something to, that they knew they could live. And we could also, and if there were public bank, and if there were postal bank, or even, any, those elements, whichever, the money could be distributed to people. That's $1,200 that came, followed closely by a letter from Trump. Did everybody get that letter from Trump talking about how wonderful he is, which is, his major subject? But the universal basic income, it would allow more activism, which is what they don't want, but it would allow more art. It would allow people not to take dumb jobs that they hate. I've always considered myself, I'm a hard worker, but I hated jobs. I always hated my job, and I'm a hard worker. It's just when they package it up into a job, it comes into this whole hierarchical thing, and you're not supposed to think except for in this one little tiny area, and that's not how people think. So another thing, so I'll repeat that, the name of that book is very readable, Utopia for Realists. Andrew Yang was talking about it, so that's coming up. So I see these three things, and I know that there are more, as important things that are happening right now. And one of them is Reform Prop 13. California, we led the wrong way 40 years ago. Let's make it right now, but it's a tough uphill battle, but we can do that. Find out about universal basic income and talk about how that's realistic. And go to the resources that have been given for public banking. I know publicbankinginstitute.org will get you there. By the way, my website is laurawells.org, and so I have some of these references at my website, laurawells.org. Yeah, so those three things. Reform Prop 13, talk up, find out about and talk up universal basic income, and find a way that makes your heart sing to help the public banking continue its momentum that's happening right now.
Okay, so there are some more comments to come or questions. So David on phone number that ends with 9307 is next, and then I'll go to Norma after that.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you, Laura, for your list and for the recommendation of the book, Utopia for Realists. That sounds interesting. Speaking of resources, I've come across the video. I've seen it once before and just happened to review it within the last week. I was wondering if you had any comments or could add to it. It's called The Secret of Oz, and it's sort of an allegory of how Frank L. Baum's Baum, B-A-U-M, his work, The Wizard of Oz, came to be in the first place. And it's very much rooted in it is the history of international banking and how our U.S. banking system emerged, the creation of the Fed, the impact it had on public, and how it disrupted society and economics, especially local. And that would be worth a look. It's a video, 2009, 101 minutes, and I'll leave off there and just wondering if either Laura or Debbie or anyone else might be able to comment on this and anything related to that story.
Well, I'm putting it on my list to watch. Susan, Debbie, you have?
Yes, it is said that The Wizard of Oz was an allegory about money, that the yellow brick road is about having a gold-based currency.
Yellow brick road.
I haven't seen all the, I haven't seen it, so I don't remember all the details, but it's anything that analyzes our financial system is definitely worth looking at.
Okay, so Norma, you're next.
I've seen arguments about how the UBI would be a bad thing. Probably you have too. I wonder if we could say them. I don't remember any of them.
Inflation.
Hmm?
Inflation. They say it would be inflationary. Or
And they say people would stop working.
That people
Everybody would just put their feet up.
Such BS.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. I'll address the inflation question. Just please go to ellenbrown.com and look up a blog of hers that she writes about the UBI, and she talks about how she directly talks about that argument of the inflation of it not causing inflation.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Okay, so the next person is Jean, but I just wanted to make a quick comment that the rise of banking system is associated with capitalist production to the scale that it has. It started with trading capital, and that's what undermined democracy in France in 1851. You know, it was partly that and the landlords. And Marx's third volume starts addressing that in the rise of monopoly. And then, of course, Lenin writes big time on it. So right now, since Lenin's time, the amount of financial strength of big banks have actually multiplied. It's not even as big as in Lenin's time. So we're up against is a gigantic monster of dead capital, which is finance capital. Anyway, that's my comment. Jean, you're next. I'm going to lower your hand and unmute you. You're already on.
Hey, I guess I'm on. Yeah, well, yeah, I wanted to just mention, first of all, there's on The Wizard of Oz, there's a nice series called Wizards of Money. Google it if you can. It's put on by this woman, Smithy, who calls herself a wizard from the land of Oz. And she goes into this whole business, including the book itself, and talks about some of the struggles over, there was a period in our history when monetary policy, whether we have the gold standard, silver standard, and so forth, were burning issues. So that I found that very interesting and useful. And some time ago, we had a very good talk. I think Karen Stewart led that on David Graeber's book, Debt, which is also, I don't know if we've recorded that or not, but it was a very useful discussion. So I
Karen
think
is here, by the way. Karen is here and she can comment on it.
Maybe she wants to comment on it, but I just thought it was a very good discussion. And, this whole issue of monetary policy, I think is very important. On the UBI, I'll just note that our Peace and Freedom Party platform for a long time has had the call for a guaranteed job or basic income as a key part. And again, I think the two go together. Guaranteed job and also a basic income for those who can't, or for some reason, either temporary or what, don't want to work. But they need to be fit together in a comprehensive way. And of course, it's easy to make it sound ridiculous, but it's not. So I will pause there. Maybe Karen wants to talk.
Karen, you have any comment on that? Karen, you want to comment on that?
Well, the only thing that I had heard about the guaranteed annual income that was a potential problem is just that certain kinds of the costs of necessities like healthcare, health insurance is so high that a guaranteed annual income wouldn't even touch the real costs that people have. So that was a problem with it, that you needed to sort of analyze what is it, item by item that people actually need to live, that just sort of putting out $1,000 a month. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea, but that it takes a much more comprehensive analysis.
Okay,
And
your response?
possibly in conjunction with health insurance or health care being single payer paid by the government.
Right.
Laura,
Right.
your response?
A lot of times they'll say people in another country only make so much money per month, but they've got their taxes, whatever, you know, their government provides healthcare. Their government provides higher education. Their government provides these things. And so that's all, you know, all these things work together, but people would be basically better off. I mean, think of our younger generation who are facing worse economic, for the first time ever in the US, worse economic prospects than their parents' generation. So I think that, you know, these things can all work together, and all sort of the solutions sort of point to each other. Also, one solution helps another solution happen. You know, it would be easier for us to get Medicare for all in California if we had a public bank than if we didn't have a public bank. It'd be easier, you know, and so on. And on a different subject, I was trying to think of this song that was created, Swami Biyandananda. I forget, he has a real name too, but based on the Wizard of Oz. And I'm no singer, and I can't remember any of the words, but will you remember the Scarecrow, If I Only Had a Brain? Well, it was da 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 da. If I only had a bank. The thing was about a public bank, and it was really great. So if I only had a bank, you might be able to Google it and find it. I'm not sure.
Okay, before I go to Kim, I just quick comment. I can't resist today commenting on such a rich subject. That you know, somebody here mentioned, I think Susan, that you know, the banks, or maybe you, Laura, that banks have $1, but they can lend $10. I mean, and that's really is where the fraud starts. Yeah. And Molotov, in his discussion with writer Chuev, poet Chuev, in his Molotov Remembers book, says that in a socialist society, money should be minimized. And that basically liquidity leads to all kinds of bad things. And liquidity is what they give the rich the benefit. So that's my comment. So Kim, you are next. That's my comment. And you can comment on that later, if like Laura or Susan.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of universal basic income, I just wanted to make a few comments. Marx and Engels in the manifesto have a line that says something like, as soon as the worker receives his wages, he or she is descended upon by the landlord, the pawn shop, the shopkeeper, the banker, whoever else, you know, his creditors. And as Raj and I know from going over the concept of differential rent in Capital Volume 3, in agriculture, as soon as the productivity goes up on the land, the landowner wants more rent. So as David Harvey has pointed out, one of the problems with universal basic income in a capitalist system is that I think it's a great idea. I wish it existed, but when it does exist, the people who are receiving it are going to, you know, their rents are going to go up. The price of everything's going to go up because the capitalists realize there's more money available, and they'll start charging higher prices. So that's one problem with it in a capitalist system.
And then you tax them more.
Yeah, okay.
Let's go back to the 91% after Republican President Eisenhower's 8 years.
Okay, Norma, you're next.
So, Jean, what we have to do is modify the Peace and Freedom Party platform so that it's not saying a guaranteed job, because that's got to become foul language. We have to qualify it in some way so that what we're doing is asking all people to be able to participate productively in society, and that with the understanding that work is a good thing. It is, we like it. It feels good to do, even to clean the sewer if that's what needs to be done. It feels good to take care of things, including our environments. The idea that work is a bad thing, that it's onerous and so forth, it's the same as school. People hate school, but they get to think that they love it under the indoctrination system that goes on.
Okay, so your response, and then Jean will come next.
Go ahead, Jean.
Oh,
I'm just nodding about the job thing.
I'm back on this, but again, I just wanted to comment. You know, one of the great, it really felt great when I retired, and I know I would have an income for the rest of my life, and I could do things that I really. I always had a good job teaching anyway, so I enjoyed that. But it just changes people's lives so much, and I remember. I'm told that back in the 30s, there was this student group that called themselves Veterans of Future Wars. And their slogan was, pensions now, fight later. And I think we need to think about that. And, you know, that was a very good revolutionary slogan in my mind. But
What did you say, pensions now and what?
Pensions now, fight later. Go to war
Fight.
later.
Okay,
okay.
Debbie
now,
had,
and then later on we'll fight when
okay,
we're old and decrepit.
Debbie, your comment, you
Yes,
raised your hand.
I'm coming up on something that some people may have been seeing in the chat, which is a question from Blair about community energy and public banks. And he suggested that we bring it up to the whole group, and I think that's a great suggestion. Laura said something lovely earlier about how all the solutions help the other solutions. And I think community energy and public banks are a really crystal clear example of that. So the community energy, as I think everybody on this call knows, is a model to get us out from under the profit-making PG&E model. And public banks, first of all, we were in Public Bank East Bay, we work closely with East Bay Community Energy. We've been allies from the beginning. There are East Bay Community Energy people on our interim bank board. We expect to have them on our actual bank board when the bank is up and running. But even more to the point and deeply theoretically, a public bank can fund a community energy process, right? And can make the loans and then get the profits, right? You know, right now, I don't exactly know where EBCE banks, but I'm sure it's one of the big banks because nobody else could do it, right? And so the money doesn't come back to the East Bay. The money goes to the shareholders on Wall Street. And so with a public bank,
the money goes to support fossil fuels, ironically enough.
Exactly. So with a public bank, the circle would be a circle of our money for our needs to return to our communities. And we are at Public Bank East Bay and all over the state. We're deeply committed to those connections. And I just wanted to make sure that got said.
Okay. Before, I don't see any hand, but just wanted to comment that I support Laura's and Debbie and Susan's point that when you struggle for these reform ideas, such as banking on energy in the hands of the public, local public, you are advancing the idea of eventual overthrow of capital. Because even though they may be denied, more people become involved and they can see who's blocking it. So struggling, just like workers struggling for wages, is necessary for them to do, even though it is within the system. So these ideas, all of these, when they're added up, eventually lead to something big, hopefully overthrow the system. Hasn't happened, that doesn't mean it can't happen. So I support the idea of radical reform within the system because I don't think that blocks the revolution. It will be struggled against by those who hold power. And that sets up a contention between the people who are at the bottom of society, who are workers. And by the way, on this point, I think I have a slight disagreement with my esteemed comrade Norma, because work is should be a prime want of life, and you cannot make it a bad word. The problem is work under the conditions of capital is the problem, and you cannot make it a prime want. And yes, even cleaning the lavatory, which guy like Gandhi was doing for changing society. He and his wife were going to clean the lavatory of the untouchables, whose job it was to clean the lavatory of the upper caste. And he was such a radical. He said, I'm going to invert it. And he forced his wife, who didn't want to go, which is kind of a problem. But that was Gandhi. So I think this struggle for radical reform is a path towards what we want, which is that capital not dominate us, which is overthrow of capital, in my opinion. And you, Laura, back to you and your colleagues here.
Well, it looks like we're at 12:24,
Yes.
and so we're going to end pretty soon. And I just want to, I think I've pretty much summarized, and I like the fact, Debbie, for picking up on the problems all seem to be interrelated, and the solutions are as well. And among them are reforming Prop 13, getting in a universal basic income that makes sense, and public banking. And so I wonder if Susan and Debbie, if there's something that you would like to say as a summary or whatever.
It's great to see you all and have this conversation. We'd love to have the people who are excited come to our meetings, and we'd love to have small dollar donations on our website. And we also, our email is, I'll put it in the chat, publicbankeastbay.org, and we're happy to answer questions there.
Thank you so much, everybody, for holding this important conversation.
Okay, Laura, you have final words?
Gracias, danke, thank you, merci.
Okay, well, we want to thank you, Laura, Susan, and Debbie for today's session, and everybody else who participated. So we look forward to seeing you. By the way, there are two intellectuals and worker activists in India who have agreed to make presentations in the future. In the upcoming month, we will be talking here in the program committee. And one of them is going to be on, who has theoretical thing on coronavirus and capitalism, the state of capitalism today. That thing will be very exciting. The other one is on caste and class in India. And that may be more than one session. Both should be of interest to many people here. So our programs are going to be pretty good next month. So thank you. Jean,
I disagree with you. One thing, I disagree with you about Prop 13, Laura. So
who's talking?
Nina.
Nina.
Yeah, because as a small homeowner, we will suffer terribly if we don't have Prop 13.
No, it does not affect residential at all.
Oh, okay.
It helps. Currently, let me say one more thing about that. What happened in 1978 was whatever, it might have been 50-50 when you look at the total receipts from property taxes, and that was 50-50 commercial and residential. You know what it is now? It's 72% residential and 28% commercial. That's what happened. So all in all, we are having to make up the difference in whether in other taxes and stuff like that, because we have let the corporations and their property tax off the hook. The thing to remember, it does not affect residential property. Please support it. Thank you.
Okay, Jean, Karen? Karen Stewart was
Thank everybody for being here. And thanks, Laura and Debbie and everyone. It's a good program.
Okay.
Thank you very much.